Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the case for convergence, the ROI of cloud security standardization for government. We've really been looking forward to this conversation because it gets at a challenge we hear about constantly from both sides of the government cloud marketplace. We all agree that security matters. We all agree that third-party cloud providers need to demonstrate that they can appropriately protect government data. But the question that we really want to explore today is what happens when proving security becomes unnecessarily fragmented? What does that fragmentation cost service providers? What does it cost government? And importantly, what could we gain through greater standardization, recognition, and reciprocity? That's what today's conversation is really about. And before I jump in, I just want to say a very quick and sincere thank you to our speakers, panelists, partners, and everyone joining us today for being part of the discussion. My name is Maddie Gullickson. I work on the education portion of all things GovRAMP, and we're just really excited for you to be here. So let me walk through a little bit of what's ahead today before we jump in. We're going to start by sharing some of the early findings from the GovRAMP ROI Research Series. This is work that we began earlier this year because for a long time, many of us in this space have understood the value proposition behind standardization intuitively, but we wanted to start putting actual data behind that story. And following that, we'll hear from Aidan Osborne with our friends at Carahsoft, who have some additional data exploration around GovRAMP deals and what they're seeing in the marketplace to share. And then finally, we'll move into the heart of today's webinar, an executive panel discussion focused on the operational cost of fragmentation. And we're so grateful to Joy Chatwell from Public Sector Networks for her expert moderation of our discussion. We'll also leave time at the end for audience Q&A before wrapping up with some ways that you can participate in the research and help us continue building the evidence base. And this is going to be kind of a fluid conversation in terms of Q&A. So as you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll make sure that we address them right towards the end of the webinar. So with that, let's start with why we undertook this research in the first place. So over the next few minutes, I just want to give a high level of the findings that we had from the GovRAMP Research Series. And I want to emphasize something up front. This is very, very early data. We're not presenting any of the numbers as definitive industry benchmarks. We're presenting them as directional signals, signals that are beginning to quantify challenges practitioners have been describing for years. And as you'll see, those signals have been relatively consistent. So, as state and local governments adopt more cloud services, providers are increasingly navigating multiple security frameworks. Each framework may have its own assessment requirements, documentation, evidence, timelines, costs. And for providers, that may mean paying to demonstrate similar security practices multiple times. For government, it can mean longer procurement cycles, more internal review, and potentially a smaller pool of providers being willing to or able to participate. Until now, much of the case for GovRAMP and for broader just standardization across the board has rested on kind of just general logic and anecdotal evidence. But these conversations are happening right now in legislatures, procurement offices, cloud service organizations, and vendor boardrooms. And so we really wanted to begin building an evidence base around a simple question. What is fragmentation really costing us? And what we're finding is that it isn't just a provider problem or a government problem. Both sides benefit from broader adoption, but each side's turn depends in part on the participation from the other. That's why we describe this as a flywheel, and I'll be coming back to that in a few minutes. Now, as we get into the numbers, some context about the research. We conducted two parallel surveys in February and March of 2026. One focused on service providers pursuing or maintaining security authorizations. The other focused on public sector practitioners responsible for reviewing cloud vendors. Our service provider respondents reported managing multiple concurrent frameworks, often 3 to 5, including frameworks and standards such as the SOC 2 or FedRAMP or GovRAMP, more. And I just really want to be transparent about the sample size. I did a little bit of data analysis minor in my undergrad, which was how many years ago? We don't need to talk about that, but I want to very clearly acknowledge up front that it is a very, very small initial data set. It's definitely not large enough for statistically significant conclusions. But we really wanted to share our thoughts and what we saw because the patterns are consistent and we believe they're instructive. This is also research that we really, really want to keep on building in the open, and we want more organizations to participate and contribute so that the findings can become stronger over time. So think of what follows as the beginning of the evidence base, definitely not anywhere close to the end of it. So the cost, that's the first signal. Among service providers responding to the survey, about 75% said that they spent under $25,000 on their initial GovRAMP related costs. Granted, there's a lot of costs that go into all of these different verification levels, but this was just an initial step. While about 64% reported spending more than $150,000 for initial FedRAMP authorization. We also saw a significant difference in timelines. Respondents reported that a typical GovRAMP timeline was about 4 to 6 months compared to 12 or more months for FedRAMP. Now, I want to pause here again and say that this comparison definitely needs some context. FedRAMP's level of rigor is designed for the federal environment and federal data. Now, granted, again, GovRAMP has a pretty significant level that's not far from that, but the insight for us was really helping us to better understand that a right-sized SLED standard that can create a substantially lower barrier to entry for providers really helps to bolster that opportunity to serve the state and local governments. And so when you lower that barrier, maintaining a standardized approach to security, you potentially open up the government market to a much broader range of qualified providers. But cost is only one part of the story. The second issue is duplication. Many of these frameworks usually share a common NIST foundation, and yet providers may still be asked to produce separate documentation, evidence, assessments, and artifacts for each environment. Nearly half, 47%, said that more than half of their compliance effort was redundant. But perhaps the number that should matter to us most, and then on the government side, is this one. 36% of providers said that they had declined a government contract because of compliance costs. That really changes the conversation. Because once compliance overhead becomes high enough that providers decide not to compete, fragmentation isn't simply an administrative inconvenience, it becomes a market access issue. And that ultimately affects the choices available to government. And at the same time, a whopping 93% of respondents said that they would consolidate around one broadly recognized framework. That tells us that there's significant appetite for convergence if we can create the conditions for it. Now let's look at the other side of the market. Fragmentation doesn't just create work for providers, it creates work inside government as well. Our public sector respondents reported spending an average of 114 hours on the initial security review of a single vendor, with responses ranging from 35 to 192 hours. Every respondent reported longer procurement times. And they also cited the internal review capacity as a procurement delay, and half indicated that complexity contributed to shadow IT. Another finding that stood out was the confidence in the cross-framework equivalency. So really trying to get at the idea that there is this really significant demand and appetite for better clarity of how some of these different frameworks can work together, and where there's some of that harmonization that can happen. And so really at the end of the day, that points us to that the return on having more of that standardization or harmonization isn't necessarily about eliminating the security assessment itself. It's about reducing the time that agencies spend re-reviewing providers whose security posture has already been independently reviewed. And that's where things like what we're going to explore a little bit more become operationally meaningful. And then this brings us to the last piece of the GovRAMP adoption flywheel. The opportunity here isn't simply just getting more providers authorized or getting more states to recognize GovRAMP, though those two things reinforce each other. It starts when more state and local governments adopt or recognize a common framework, and then that creates a larger addressable market, which gives more providers a reason to pursue authorization. And as more providers go into that as well, then agencies gain access to a stronger pipeline of providers whose security has already been evaluated, and that helps to reduce some of the review burden. So as we see, as more governments and providers participate, confidence deepens and meaningful security becomes more practical. And so that is as we fit into, yeah, thank you, Chandler. So as we look at pulling all of this together, we see some consistent signals that ultimately there is an entry point that we need to continue to emphasize that can really allow for less friction in gaining access to the market. The cost advantage piece is real and is important to consider. Duplication effort is also real. Organizations are continually and repeatedly paying to demonstrate security practices, and that burden means that there's not as much investment potentially in contributing to other innovative ways to provide a different product, a better product, and or continuing to improve the security at the root. And ultimately that there is an actual market barrier that is directly caused by having the fragmentation. But finally, also, government practitioners really are wanting access to a trusted pipeline of providers that have the confident and pre-authorized approach that where they can really rely on that independent assessment. And so I really just want to end this section where we started it, which this is the beginning. It's absolutely not the full conclusion. We need more data, we need more providers participating, and we need more of our public sector organizations also telling us what this process actually costs them. Because the stronger the evidence becomes, the more equipped we are to have really serious and informed conversations about the framework recognition piece that really can move us all forward. And at that point, that's a perfect point to broaden the lens out to some survey data the survey data really only gives us one way to understand what's happening, but we can also look at some of the actual market activity that can tell us about what adopting one consistent framework has done in terms of government purchasing. And so I'm pleased to turn things over to Aidan Osborne from Carahsoft. Aidan's going to walk us through some additional data exploration around GovRAMP deals and what Carahsoft is seeing in the market. So Aidan, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Maddie. Nice to meet you all. I'm Aidan Osborne, FedRAMP Program Manager here at Carahsoft. And so this is a very, very important issue that I deal with every day, talking with vendors, and they are looking at all these compliance frameworks and trying to understand the best way to approach it. And so there's some on the ground numbers I'm here to present, and then also like talking about, or Maddie was going through CSP, seeing some of these government contracts and actually turning them down just due to the compliance burden. This is definitely something that we're trying to change, and that we want cutting edge commercial software being sold to public sector. And so from kind of like a data backed approach, I've been able to pull a lot of data with the GovRAMP vendors that work with Carahsoft or partnered with Carahsoft. We've been able to see a lot of trends. And so across the board, we always see positive uptick from GovRAMP authorization. And so as you can see, 51% increase in total booking dollars post GovRAMP authorization. We've seen increase 71% increase in just the order volume, and so the total bookings. And then just for our SaaS perspective, we've seen a 70 or 67% increase in total bookings. So there's definitely the demand there. And so getting CSPs on board with investing in compliance is important, not only for the CSP's business, but also just for our data security. And so I would say the bottom line is that GovRAMP accelerates the CSP's path to market, and providing that trusted standardized framework, it gives the states and local agencies confidence and access to a lot of these cutting edge solutions. And so it's really important that we continue to build out this trust framework and work hopefully to harmonize these so that it is not as much of an issue for these CSPs that are moving through, and they don't have to juggle three different frameworks when it's all rooted in the same common rule set.
Aiden, thank you so much for doing that and doing that research too. We were on another call the other day, and I think we might have crashed his system with the amount of data that he was going through. So we really appreciate you sacrificing that and going through and finding that information. And I really loved what you said about the trust framework piece because that's the heart of what we're really trying to get to. And so now that we have had a little bit of that foray into some data, we want to talk a little bit more about the operational reality behind it, because ultimately every one of those statistics given or numbers represented, it all represents an actual decision that somebody has to make, whether it's a provider deciding whether something's worth pursuing, a security team deciding whether they can rely on an assessment, or a procurement team even waiting for a security review before it can move forward. So really at the end of the day, now we're going to really hit the operational piece of it. And for our next portion of the program, we are excited to chat with some folks who have the experience of these challenges from different sides of the ecosystem. We're pleased to be joined by Jen Dvorak with the Idaho Judicial Branch, David Brosi with 360 Advance, and Aiden's going to join as well with the Carahsoft perspective as well. And really, rather than simply asking whether some of the standardization is a good idea, we want to just dig more into the harder questions of where does the friction really come from, and where does it show up on the day-to-day side, and who is ultimately bearing some of those costs, and what do those costs really look like? And ultimately, and perhaps more importantly, what can we be changing to really improve security and trust all across the board? So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joy, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Maddie, and hello everyone. I'm Joy Chatwell. I'm the VP of Product and Partnerships at Public Sector Network. In my role, I work with government and vendors across all of North America, and a big part of what I do is research, looking at how we can help government improve services for citizens. And PSN connects leaders through conferences, roundtables, webinars, and executive briefings, and also our online platform. And so our goal is quite simple. We want to help public sector professionals have the research that they need at their fingertips and make peer connections and have access to practical insights that they need to do their job better. So today's conversation is a wonderful example of that. And I've really been excited to work with GovRAMP and Carahsoft to share this new research. And it has such real implications for how government buys and secures cloud services. We're joined today by representatives from government and the private sector. So if you have a question, please pop it into the chat. We will address it in the Q&A at the very end. So first of all, let's get into some introductions. Aiden, I know you very briefly introduced yourself before you shared your information, but perhaps just tell us a little more about the work that you do and how Carahsoft sits across both government and the vendor sides of the market.
Certainly. So yeah, I specifically am on our FedRAMP team, and I work with new vendors who are new to public sector, trying to understand these compliance frameworks, trying to understand how to go about engaging with public sector agencies. And so from there, it's a lot of helping them either point them in the direction of our partners in the ecosystem, whether it's GovRAMP or whether it's our accelerator or GRC tooling partners to help them on the technical side, the technical readiness that's required for these security frameworks, or it's kind of helping them from a go-to-market perspective of how to actually, what agencies to go after, what use case makes sense for these agencies, kind of building out that go-to-market. Um, at a broader perspective, Carahsoft, are I would say help from end to end for the process of vendors that are coming and trying to sell to these public sector agencies. It's a very complicated process. Helping out, whether it's the contract vehicles, getting these orders followed through. There's a huge value that Carahsoft can provide kind of on the marketing, go-to-market process. And it beyond even operations, things like that. So definitely happy to help get you guys connected where needed be. But yeah, me specifically, FedRAMP and security framework fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Aidan. And Jen, could you perhaps introduce yourself and give us a feel for your role, specifically the kinds of cloud procurement and security decisions that land on your desk?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jen Dvorak. I'm the CIO for the Idaho Judicial Branch. We're a statewide court system here in Idaho, serving all 44 counties. I've been in this role 5 years now with the team. And prior to that, I came from the state of Arizona. I spent over 10 years there. And I was really excited to bring a lot of that mature compliance framework that we had built in Arizona to Idaho and use that as a framework here. We buy everything. We're a government entity that does a lot of different things, and a lot of our business is moving to the cloud, either vendor driven or internally with our work here in our agency. But really moving to the cloud was an important milestone for us, and we wanted to make sure that we're doing it securely. We hold citizen data, we hold a lot of important data, and making sure that it is secured is the utmost importance for us. I always feel like, my data is part of that as well. So I want to make sure, working in the public sector, that I'm protecting the folks that I serve and myself as well. So having that rigor around security, making sure that our vendors are securing our data just as we would in-house.
Thank you, Jen. And David, please round out the panel. Introduce yourself and 360 Advanced. Tell us what you do and who you typically work with.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Joy. And thanks for joining, everyone. I'm happy to be here. And I'm a practice director at 360 Advanced. I lead the large majority of the work that we do in the government services space, which of course includes GovRAMP. We are an accredited 3PAO, so we do a lot of the assessment work for our clients, but we also sit on the other side of the desk with them to help them learn from our experiences and what we know about GovRAMP and other government compliance frameworks to help them build out their programs as well. So really help on both sides of things. So we have that that perspective of understanding what do the assessors typically look for, and use that knowledge to help them build out a program. Then, of course, if we are the assessor, right, we've done quite a few of these assessments at this point and have helped organizations build their programs from the ground up. So, yeah, 360 Advanced as a whole, we do work in the government service space, and as you can see behind me, on my wallpaper, a few other areas as well. So, thanks again.
Thank you. So we want to get started by talking about the current compliance landscape and also some of the pain points that the research has started to dig into. So Jen, I'd like to start with you, please. What does the cloud review process look like from the government side, and where do procurement and security teams spend the most time?
Thank you, Joy. That's a really great question. And I'll say that Maddie's comments really resonated with me at the top of the talk. Especially with regards to limited vendor pools. Working in the courts, that's very specialized, the softwares that we work with. So our vendor pools are already pretty limited. So to not have security and compliance in that vendor space, it makes it even harder to procure. And that just adds to the time that we have to make purchases, to get our services implemented so that we can serve the people of Idaho. So I would say that our process is also duplicative, so that also resonated with me. Our process, our own internal RAMP process is based on FedRAMP and GovRAMP. And so instead of FedRAMP or GovRAMP providing that, our team does that. And by team, I mean we have one dedicated resource on our very small security team who can perform that work. And so as you can imagine, when things start to get backed up or we're in a really heavy purchasing season right at the beginning of the fiscal year, he gets really backed up and it takes a really long time. Oftentimes we'll work with a vendor and it does become onerous on the provider, on the vendor, and they just kind of stop communicating with us. We've had that happen. We've also had it where we've worked for over a year working to get the compliance, to get the attestations. So that means I have a dedicated resource on my team who is working with provider resources. So if you just think in terms of cost per hour that these folks are spending on doing that versus outsourcing that to another reviewer team, that's kind of where we're at. When we have to do it, it can take a lot of time, especially when you're working with a vendor who maybe you haven't built as much trust with. They don't want to just send you a bunch of documents. They want you to go into a review process with them. And so we've had to do that. So every document for attestation, we've had to review with the vendor. And that is quite onerous. And I can only imagine from vendor perspective, but even just from our own, I mean, that is, in terms of time and resource allocation, that's huge for a smaller organization, especially in state government.
Thank you, Jen. And yeah, that cost of time being such a key issue. Moving over to Aidan, I'm curious to hear what technology providers are telling you about today's fragmented compliance environment, and how does managing multiple security frameworks affect their ability to even serve government customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say on a daily basis, am dealing with cloud service providers who they're coming from commercial and they maybe have their SOC 2 Type 2, and now we're looking at FedRAMP, they're looking at GovRAMP, they're looking at these frameworks, and they're trying to understand how, what the best way to go about actually like accomplishing these frameworks when there's so much overlap, but then there's also like two completely different processes in terms of getting that through. And so it can be a pretty difficult discussion. I would say there's, once again, to that point earlier of the CSPs that turn down these government contracts, there's probably even a greater number in that get stuck in this, I would say, like research purgatory where they're trying to understand whether they need to go SLED or to go Fed and how to do that and what looking for these total addressable markets. And it would be because there's like two separate pathways that they kind of have to go after right now. That makes it pretty difficult for them to be able to actually execute and feel like confident with where they're going. And I've definitely seen that become a problem. So it makes for some fun discussions, and definitely like the more we're able to harmonize these things, the easier those discussions will become of like if securing one framework and being able to attack all these markets the same would definitely allows for a lot more open doors to these cloud service providers.
Thank you. Yes. And David, I want to bring you into this conversation. Where do you see providers experiencing the greatest burden? And when we're talking about cost with providers, it's not just the time cost, there's also the audit fees, but are there any other hidden costs as well that organizations encounter?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's hidden costs. There's definitely the operational costs of putting a lot of things in play, depending on where they are in their, security and compliance journey. And that's a really big variable that we try to help our clients identify and work on with them to just be able to quantify what is this going to take, how much it's going to cost. And that's usually everyone's first question. And that's the most difficult question to answer is what is it going to cost, how long is it going to take? And it's definitely a loaded question, but it's something that we do our best to try to understand where our clients are at today. And, as we're talking about harmonization and, bringing everything together within their security program, that's really our starting point is like, what are you doing now? And whether it's a SOC 2 or it could be a high trust program, whatever it may be, we try to understand, where there's some overlap in not only the controls, also the scope, which is a big part of it too, because certain organizations take they approach government a little bit differently and sometimes want to silo away parts of the environment. It ends up, of course, adding the cost, but also simplifies their journey and getting things implemented too. There's less implications across the way. So I would say, the cost is definitely a huge variable, hard to identify. The audit side of things is a little bit more fixed. I think we had some slides up earlier that gave a range of what organizations experience as part of their initial assessment. That may have been up there. That's a little more easy to predict, but the big variable is really just understanding, how much time is going to take to put all these things in place. What, adaptions or changes do we need to make to our current infrastructure to make all this work? So.
And just sort of adding to that, how does duplicated work affect timelines and staffing and just the overall readiness of things?
Duplicative work, it absolutely, it's a big burden on both sides of things. So I'll speak to probably the easier of the two first, which is on the assessment side of things. If an organization has to go through multiple audits, that's not something that anyone typically likes to sign up for. What we try to do on our end, before we get started working with a client, we try to identify what they're already working on, what audits they currently go through, where the overlap is, so we can do the best we can on the assessment audit side of things to lessen the burden, try to audit once and report many. There is the opportunity for that where there's overlap. So let's say someone's doing a SOC 2 type 2 and they are going through a GovRAMP authorization. The idea is that we overlay these two and that we make it as less painful on them as possible. So using documentation and evidence more than once, so we can ask for it once, but use it across multiple assessments. That's really the goal that we try to achieve on the audit side of things, assuming all the timing lines up. Now, when it comes to building and on the advisory side of things to help them build out the program, duplication does become an issue sometimes, especially when what I mentioned earlier with having separate environments. If that's the route that organizations want to take, having like a separate enclave for government services is something that organizations pursue from time to time, and then having to have a separate tool stack, having to have separate processes, separate documentation, all those things are really burdens on the organization and really highlight the opportunity to bring a lot of things together and create a unified program. And a lot of times, more often than not, taking the greatest common factor, what's the most stringent framework that you have to conform to, and let's build a program around that if we can, to see if that makes sense for the organization. That helps lessen the duplication of many things, right? Of cost, of effort, processes, technologies, all those.
All right, thank you. And a reminder to everybody listening in, please do post your questions into the chat and we will get to them later on. Moving on to the procurement and framework convergence. Jen, you mentioned having one person doing pretty much all the reviewing on your team. So how does a standardized authorization help agencies like yours move faster?
Absolutely. It really helps us take that work that we would typically do, that one for one, question for question with the vendor, and essentially outsource it to a framework like GovRAMP, where We still have to do our due diligence. We still need to have that oversight, but we could get that data all in one piece as a snapshot and review it. But everything's all together. The vendor provider has already let us look at everything essentially because they've done that through GovRAMP. We don't have to go chasing after them or go back and forth on emails or meetings to try to get that information. And it's just a really nice package. And then, we provide it to our legal team, our contracts folks, and they have a level of trust in that we've done the review with the help of our partner like GovRAMP. And we trust that everything that we're providing to those folks so that they can make a good decision is all there. And it really does reduce the amount of time. We still have to do our review, but the data's already there in one place. It's organized, it's ready to go. And then maybe we just have one or two questions that we have to follow up on, but in general, it's a much smoother process for us.
All right, and what builds confidence in relying on another jurisdiction's assessment?
Well, I think we're sort of doing that anyways as government entities. We always reach out to our partners and say, have you done a security review on this particular vendor? What did you learn? I mean, that's information that we share internally. But the fact that there is a third-party review on top of that, somebody who does this all the time, that really gives us that additional sense of confidence that they've asked the right questions. We know what questions they've asked. And an answer was provided. And if not, then there's also, steps that they're going to remediate some of those findings or those gaps. Again, all that information is outlined for us. So it is trust, but it's also verify. So we have the verification that we need to move that forward with our contracts, our legal, and our executive leadership.
All right. Thank you. And Aidan, how does the compliance burden influence competition within the government marketplace? Are you hearing anything from the folks that you're working with regard to that?
So I think that a great stat that kind of shows how these compliance frameworks burden the competition level is if you look at the AWS marketplace and there's about 10,000 services on the AWS marketplace, and then you look at the FedRAMP or you look at GovRAMP authorized services and it's less than 1,000, is just kind of shows how much of a market is still not able to reach that, or like is still not bought into these compliance frameworks, and like how much available commercial software is not being used in the public sector. In that, so definitely I would say that for agencies, there's a huge lack of diversified software that's available to them from these frameworks specifically. And that's kind of where I would point to every time as if I'm asked that question. And hopefully I'd say like the end state for these frameworks is that that delta is closed significantly in the near future of then getting as much cutting edge software as where compliance isn't the barrier and it's whether or not the use case for government is applicable. That's what should be the barriers, like the use case actually being useful for the government and being worth being bought, not the compliance being the blocker there.
And are you seeing growing interest from agencies and providers in a standardized authorization and reciprocity?
I definitely would say from the provider side, yes. It's a little harder to know from the agency side. I would assume just that it would make life a lot easier, just like Jen was saying, as far as like having that package at one place, understanding it, just like from the concept of keeping things consistent, like a process that's consistent can becomes faster and faster and faster. So I would assume yes on the government side, but at least on the CSP side, I can say for sure or it's definitely a need for some consistency with these frameworks.
All right.
And Joy, if I can just sort of add to that as well, one of the things that we've struggled with providers is them even understanding what we're asking for because of the framework, NIST or CIS. And so it's not just that they're taking the time to provide us the answers to the compliance question. We actually have to explain it to them and give them examples, and that takes a lot of time too. And I've had conversations with providers and asking them, when are you going to go to something like GovRAMP? When are you going to go to something like NIST? And they don't even know where to get started. And I think in terms of having a consolidated framework like GovRAMP, what they would give back to me is, well, is that here to stay? Like, is that gonna, stay the course? Because we don't want to put all the time and resources into something like that and for the government entities to move to something else, which I totally get. So we really do need that standardization, and also as government entities saying this is working for us and we want the providers to have this, it's valuable. From our perspective, we need to have a little bit more consistency and standardization as well.
Thank you, Jen. Yes. And David, building on that, since we're talking about the cost of time and the consistency, if a provider already has one authorization, how much of that work realistically could actually carry over to another?
When you say authorization, you're referring to another GovRAMP authorization, or is that something else?
Yes, if somebody's already had sign off from GovRAMP, how much do you think could carry over?
So carrying over to another GovRAMP authorization of higher level, or are you referring to another type of authorization, such as like FedRAMP or?
No, when they're working from one agency, perhaps with Idaho, and then they decide to work with the court system, perhaps in another jurisdiction.
Oh, right,
but
right.
it's also
Okay.
working with GovRAMP.
Yeah. The whole idea of the program is that you build it once and reuse it many times, right? So you've made it through the authorization process. You've shown that you've met the benchmarks, at your desired impact level, of course. And I think that is the one differentiator that may vary from agency to agency or state to state is what they're requiring, right? Depends on the type of information that's being shared, the criticality of the system. But the whole idea is that there's reciprocity across all of the different areas, all the agencies and state and local government that have onboard themselves into the GovRAMP program, saying that yes, we this does meet our bar, we are going to accept it. I think that's a big part of trying to spread this out across not just all frameworks, but also the adopters of this at the agency level, making sure that everyone agrees that this is the right thing to do. This is where we want to put our money into. This is an investment, not just a one-time cost. And we want to make sure we're putting in the right area, and continuously building upon that is going to give providers the comfort that they need to say that, okay, we're ready to invest now because we know this isn't going away. We know this is valuable across all different parts of the public sector and state and local government. We want to make sure we do this. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to make sure that we can spread this out and make sure that everyone adopts a unified and standardized framework.
And what would that unified standardized framework look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's the market somewhat drives that, and it's a moving target. It's it's evolved over the years since all this has started. The backbone has consistently been NIST and NIST 853. That's always that's been around for quite some time now, and that's really been what everyone points to. If may that change over the course of time? Probably, but is it going to drastically change overnight? I don't think so. I think this is really the backing of everything right now, and whether it be the federal side of things or the state and local government or even private sector, it's something that everyone looks at as the benchmark and the standard that we need to meet. So making sure that we have a framework such as GovRAMP that is backed by, authoritative source such as NIST 853 or whatever the predecessor or successor will be later. That's going to add to the credibility and add for the ability to reuse and the reciprocity that you asked about. So just making sure that, we're consistent across that and making sure that we're, keeping our eyes ahead, right, from all aspects, making sure that we understand what's coming too, so that as, organizations are investing in GovRAMP, that they also see where it's moving, because it will evolve over time, just like everything else. And, making sure that you're forward looking and, meeting the needs of the agencies as well is a big part of that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Now we are due to start moving into Q&A, but I don't yet see any questions in the chat. So while hopefully everyone starts frantically typing their questions, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to just look ahead for us and offer a piece of advice. So Aidan, perhaps you could go first. What advice would you offer providers planning their compliance strategy over the next several years?
Yeah, similar to what David was saying, there's a lot changing in this as far as what we're seeing from a compliance framework and perspective, and it's kind of a moving target. But I would care to say that good security is good security, and that these general security principles are, whether it's in FedRAMP or in GovRAMP or whatever there may be as the backing, is still going to be true. And so looking at like the NIST control families and what they're actually testing for, at those principles will still remain true. Like that will still be good security down the road. And so building for GovRAMP, building for FedRAMP, you're still building on and building evidence for these good security principles. And so it would be it is having a harmonized framework. I definitely will make this process work a lot easier and make, from the procurement side, things move a lot smoother. But at the end of the day, we are looking to protect data, and like, just because this is a difficult landscape to kind of survey, it doesn't mean that you abandon it entirely, and that we should still be building good security within our CSPs. And as these frameworks continue to work their evolve, that if you invest in your security practices, I think it'll benefit you in the long run.
All right, thank you. And David, what advice would you give to providers who are planning their compliance strategy over the next several years?
Yeah, I'll bring up one of the things that's very common. One of the common conversations that we have, and it kind of points back to the good old saying of the chicken or the egg. And that comes into play when organizations are trying to decide whether they want to go down the road of, and this could apply to anything, but specifically GovRAMP here, whether they want to invest in it. And what are their options? How do they get into this market? What, for the purpose of GovRAMP, what impact level do they need to align to? If they don't have an agency sponsor, an agency they're working with directly. That's a tough question to answer, right? If you're building things in a hypothetical mindset. One thing that I always think is more valuable than people want to appreciate sometimes is just having a conversation with any agencies that you may be working with, or ones that are interested in your product, to really just open up the door of transparency so you understand what they're looking for. I think some people just think, oh, there's GovRAMP in an RFP, so like let's just figure out what that means. But realistically, that could mean a lot of different things. And I think a lot of our clients that we work with will spin their wheels a little bit longer than they probably should, trying to figure it out on their own. There's people you can speak to. There's the agencies that are asking for these things to help you understand exactly where you need to get started and where it makes sense to invest, and really what you need to build your roadmap off of. How long does this need to take? All those things are things that you should know beforehand as much as you possibly can, to help minimize costs, to maximize efficiency, and to make sure that you're building something in accordance to how it's going to be used. So I would say that's probably one of my biggest piece of advice and something that we run into all the time.
Thank you, David. And now, Jen, I'm going to ask you for two pieces of advice, if you don't mind. What practical steps can government leaders take today to reduce unnecessary compliance burden while still maintaining strong security? And what advice would you like to impart to any vendors, assessors, organisations like GovRAMP that are on the call to continue improving the process for government?
Absolutely. So I would just say that anything that you can do to lift the burden off of already stretched security resources for any government entity is really going to win them over for you, I would say, because that is really helpful. We are limited. We are always trying to do more with less. So I would say anytime a provider can take some of that burden and use a framework like GovRAMP, especially with the backing of NIST 853. I mean, I don't know a government entity who doesn't use that as at least a baseline for their security controls. I think that's super important. And then my advice to other government entities would be that, really dig into your contracts, make sure that you are having that information that can hold providers accountable for the security and for the data that they hold for you. It's easy to say these things. It's quite another thing to have attestation and to prove it. So I would really look at your procurement contracts, make sure that your security reviews are aligned with GovRAMP and FedRAMP if you're not utilizing them as a framework today.
Thank you, Jen. Now we have had some questions come in the chat. So Judy Owen represents a CSP and has listed a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is around the challenges with Convergence using PCI DSS as an example. PCI SSC won't accept anything other than their own assessments, just as GovRAMP won't accept a PCI DSS ROC. Is there truly a strategy to help CSPs in such an issue of reducing assessments?
So I thank you so much, Joy. I'm gonna dig on that question. Before I do, I wanted to make a shameless plug from Jen's last comment there. GovRAMP did just publish a government adoption guide that I highly encourage all of our attendees, including providers, to go and take a look at. All we require of you is your email. But it is a free guide, and it really does walk through how governments can build up these third-party risk management programs in a really strategic way that can help offload some of that burden around the security and procurement side, including some draft procurement language that can be useful in contracts. To really help start to provide that guidance. So I just want to throw that shameless plug out there because it was such a perfect transition, Jen, as you were saying it. It's like, ooh, we have an answer for that. But back to Judy's questions. Thank you so much for putting those in. We really appreciate it. I think on the first one, there's a couple different layers to that. So the first part is, I think the phrasing of the convergence with that. So that one in particular, that's going to be more of credit card data versus where GovRAMP really is focusing on all types of data. And I think, but what I think getting to what your bigger part of the question is something that we are actively working on. And we've recently hit it with CGIS as an example, but we're also talking with a couple of other federal agencies as well at the beginning levels of discussions. But it's more of how do we get to the spot where there's that good baseline that really covers just about everything, but then whatever that delta is for the kind of one-off need, that we're able to more clearly identify what that delta or what that change or what that gap is, and outline that better for providers working in the space. And so So with your kind of bigger question of reducing that assessments, that's really the goal, is that, and we are actively working on it, is how we can continue to demonstrate that the bulk of what we need to have demonstrated, of what most organizations are going to need from a security standpoint, and then whatever that extra little level of, I don't mean little, extra level of support and security is needed, that becomes a much clearer ask. And so we do have work groups around those things. I highly encourage you also to engage on those, bring up more of these types of topics, more of these gaps that that you see where there's a need to address that kind of overlay effort. But then also in the second piece of your question, I think it also gets to two of the key points that we talked a little bit about in this conversation, which, one, the whole key is it is a flywheel. We do, and that's what we're trying to continue to enforce, that the more that we do have our governments requiring it at some level, the more that there's going to be that adoption on the provider side. And similarly, as Aidan's data was able to demonstrate too, though, that really is kind of kickstarting that ongoing cycle. But also, to your point, even just of the cost aspect, it's really a key part of why GovRAMP invested in building the Progressing Snapshot program, as well as security program, as well as core, as more accessible on-ramps into this verification space that allows for organizations to jump in where maybe they were just used to kind of paying for the SOC 2 piece, but now you're really investing in not just that point in time assessment, but you're really investing in and I'm going to borrow Aidan's phrase again, but the trust framework, right? And that you're really investing in a process to continue to contribute into that, because especially with GovRAMP, it's not just the point in time aspect, it is the continuous monitoring. And that is a huge piece that does become a burden off of governments in particular, because it really does allow for that one poor security person in your team, Jen, to not have to be constantly trying to track down and follow every single vulnerability that gets identified, seeing if it's in their ecosystem and who's on top of it, who's doing what to address it, et cetera. That's a huge piece of value that is in the investment. And so it's really not just, again, it's what we're really try to advocate, that we're really trying to move away from compliance being yet another checklist or yet another assessment that you're doing. You're really investing in the bigger security of the ecosystem and trust in the ecosystem, and building really, sometimes it gets overused, but really building the boat that's in the rising of all tides concept. And so I was muddling a couple of the different metaphors in my head there, but really trying to build something bigger. And so that, coupled with the reduced cost on ramps that we've provided, that's really where we are continuing to try to address these gaps. And absolutely, again, I just really want to advocate, the more ideas and questions and thoughts you have on the provider side and the government side, we have space for you and a table for you to share more of your questions and concerns and thoughts. Because we all want to make this better. And so with that, I'm going to pause because I realize there's also another question.
Yes, Michael has got their hand raised.
Yes. I don't know. Can I? Chandler, I should be able to unmute Michael, correct?
Yeah, they should be able to unmute now.
Okay. Michael. We should be able to hear you.
Michael, you might need to unmute yourself before you start speaking.
While I wait for that little indicator to go off, I do just thank you so much for your questions, Judy, because I think these are the conversations that we really need to have at that tangible level. So thank you again.
Michael's saying in the chat that they're not able to mute themselves. Oh,
I got it. It
Awesome.
allowed me now.
All right, go for it,
Yay!
Michael. What's your question?
Yay. For probably the biggest mistake you guys made by allowing me to talk, but I will go quick. Thank you again for putting this on. This is great. Aiden, I know Aiden from the Carahsoft world, and thanks for those numbers. I'm Michael Cardesi. I'm with FedHive. We're an accelerator, and we're trying to engage with trying to pull all those frameworks together. The GovRAMP, we're a big proponent of GovRAMP and all the work that they're doing, and I support you guys quite a bit. Obviously, engage with FedRAMP, engage with DoD with the SRG, CMMC stuff. We got our level 2. Like, we're doing all of these pieces, so I understand all the pain and anxiety. But one of the things that we're trying to do is engage with FedRAMP. They've come out to industry and said, hey, we want you to help to resolve some of these problems. And as AI starts to pick up and the security issues start to accelerate faster and faster, they're asking industry to come and help them with being able to see these threats, using AI or using other tools and that sort of thing. So I wanted to ask Jennifer, are the states, are you seeing the states open to trying to partner with the security organizations like ourselves and other accelerators to try and help put together tool sets that allow you, as AI starts to pick up more and more speed, engage in conversation on what you're trying to look at, what your pain points are, those resources that you have, or the few resources, and everybody's in the same boat, right? Like this, hard to get a hold of people there, it's rampant everywhere. But are you open to allowing your resources, obviously they're precious, but to try and figure out how to solve your pain points, the tactical pain points, in addition to, yep, we have a framework, but these are going to be ever evolving. So, that's today. So that's my question. Apologize to ramble a bit.
No, I think it's a great question. Thank you. So we've engaged with GovRAMP. I know they have a AI work group specifically that they've been starting up because we've been encountering the same type of questions like, okay, cloud security providers, we're good. We got it. We have a really solid process. But now AI is coming into the mix, introducing a lot more security risk, uncertainty. And so we have been leaning on some of our partners for that. We've been working with some external partners, certainly, specifically in the court space to help us identify some of that. So I would say from my perspective, yeah, I think it's great. And we're really trying to leverage the relationships we already have to answer some of those AI questions.
Great. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And I do realize that we are actually amazingly past time. So I want to be really sensitive to our panelists' time. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. Thank you, Jen, for answering that. Thank you for the question. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to dig into it, but we really do appreciate everyone for joining us and starting on this journey of capturing more of the stories that, like what you heard today on the panel. And so, a couple things to take away. Please engage with us. Please sign up for a working group. Please participate. Please bring your questions, your ideas. If you are interested in actually participating in that survey so we can continue to get more data for the story and to better understand what the challenges are, please let us know. And we'll see you around the block at future events, but and hopefully on some working groups. But again, thank you so much to our panel for just excellent sharing your perspectives, your time. Joy, thank you for your moderation. Beautifully done, and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you all.
Thank you.